Well, hi, Kepler families. Welcome to another live featuring a Kepler teacher. In this case, we have teacher Karla Memmott. Welcome, Karla.
Welcome. Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me a part of the Kepler vision. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, well, we are too, and summer term is coming up in just a few weeks, and fall is not far behind. This coming fall, you are teaching a course on human movement. Now, some classical teachers like to meditate upon the transmigration of the soul. For you, you're thinking about souls actually moving around. I don't want to get into the nature of the soul right now necessarily, but human movement, going places. So you have this course, but you're completing your doctorate
Correct.
on human movement as well. Maybe you could give us an overview of what your current scholarly work is.
My focus right now is 19th century travel literature, and I am focusing on what I consider the Wanderlust Heim Vey tension that exists within a person, and how this is motivated to help us both move forward and want to come back home, how that helps us become aware and self-aware through self-knowledge. And I focus just on 19th century travel literature.
Okay, and so this is an individual sort of thing where the individual is focusing on his wanderlust, and of course you said it properly because you speak German. There was another term in there. I think wanderlust is a term that many of us are familiar with. Whether we interpret it correctly or not could be another issue to talk about. But wanderlust, I think we're all relatively comfortable with. What was the other term you introduced?
Heim Vey. Heimweh, Heim Vey, and that is basically this connotation of homesickness. But I use the word Heim Vey instead of homesickness because to me, Heim Vey connotates the nostalgia back from the Greek word nostalgia, which is this pain in the soul, this longing of the soul. And the idea of homesickness tends to also have this connotation of the physical pain that somebody has from homesickness, which is actually something that came up from the Civil War. People started to see this when the soldiers were going off, but I try to go back to the original term.
Okay, nice. Yeah, there's as a Portuguese speaker, I speak Portuguese, and there's a word in Portuguese that both Brazilians and learners of Portuguese will claim is untranslatable, saudade. And it's also this longing sort of thing. And I try to tell people that longing is as close as it can get, but it's not a malaise, it's not a sickness, it's just this constant heart tug.
Right.
Is that
right?
Okay?
It's that it's not quite that physical pain, but it's that deep desire that we have to return to, I think, what once was.
Okay, so yeah, let's actually talk about that. Let's talk about what once was. I was thinking about that while I'm going through a Bible reading program with a group of people, and as John the Baptist was telling Jesus that he shouldn't be the one to baptize him, but Jesus is greater, so Jesus should be the one baptizing John. And I started thinking about how much in that particular setting antiquity was authority, and there's, and now we have sort of a flipped view of that. Now, the newer something is, the better something is. Is there a sense in which one of those ideas, is it just natural for people to think of an idealized past and want to go to it? Is it a real thing?
I think that's one of the issues that we have right now with our culture clash. And what I mean by that is I think that there is a trend, especially like in classical education, where there is a longing to return to what once was. And the ancient is in some ways idealized. And I think that right now in modern culture, outside of maybe the classical education movement, there is the fallacy and the holding on to it's got to be new and it's got to be better. And actually, what I think, my own personal, is that this is what is reflecting in our soul, is that we have a God-given understanding and awareness of that relationship that we had in the Garden of Eden. And there was perfection there. There was peace and purity with body, mind, and soul. And we also have that promise, like what God gave Abraham in the promised land. So we have that promise that there is someday we are going to be progressing again toward that idea of perfection. And right now we are just in this state of wilderness where we have the idea and we want perfection. We have that longing. We're just not there yet. So long answer to your question.
Yeah, but yes, so you were perennial pilgrims then. And so would you want to say then that it's that we must accept this wanderlust and this Heim Vey because we're caught between the garden that was, the garden we're going to, this is who we're going to be, these creatures of Heim Vey.
That's my concept, yeah. And that, and in that tension between the longing to return home and the desire to move forward, we learn of who we are. We experience life, we experience place when we travel, for example. And that helps us understand as human beings who we are, which is what raises awareness of self-knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point of connection then to your course this coming fall. It's a year-long course. It's a literature course entitled Human Movement, The Journey from Here to There. And you talked about the soul and talked about how we have to come to terms with this and grow into it. So how are the teenagers who are in this class, in this human movement class, what is the effect that you hope taking this course would have on them?
The young adults that I'm working with are usually 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. They are getting ready to move out of home. They're getting ready to launch into the world. And the idea that I have in helping them is to consider as they move forward, where is it that you're going? For example, I just finished a semester class this last semester where we worked our way through Les Miserables, all 1,500 pages of it. And there's this underlying theme that Hugo talks about there of progress and the benefits of progress. But we spent a long time talking about, okay, if you're progressing, where are you progressing toward? Not necessarily that it's always good. And so one of the things that I hope young adults will take from the classes is just to be intentional that as they're moving forward, as they're taking even their intellectual academic classes, asking themselves, where am I moving? And am I wandering or am I heading in the direction of my God-given talents and passions?
This really actually kind of touches me personally and the structure of the life I've been living personally. So my wife and I kind of live in this constant tension, and I don't think she'll mind me talking about this publicly because she's the one who phrased it this way. She described herself as a hobbit and me as a ranger. And, there's this, I have this tendency, I grew up moving every year, and I have this tendency to seek satisfaction in movement itself, as opposed to where I'm going and what I'm doing. And then she has this tendency to seek satisfaction in staying still. But that's also not necessarily in itself a good, right? So we both have these, we search for an easy solution when in fact it's more about where we're going or what we're building. So, when you talk about this sort of thing, it really is for me, something that I've been wrestling with. So what is you say progressing to, what ought we to be progressing to? And before you answer that, I just want to say hello to viewers that we have in South Florida and in Gramado City, Brazil. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so what are we progressing to? What ought we to progress to?
Well, I'm going to go back to your marriage first because
do it.
You guys have a hobbit marriage. And what I mean by that is you've got the Baggins who likes to stay at home, and you have the Took who likes to go on the adventure. And so together, the two of you have a hobbit marriage where you get to move forward and have the adventure. She will keep you and draw you home, and you will encourage her to have the adventure. So anyway, I just like that, which is one of the
Yeah,
focus of my class. You can tell her now we have a Hobbit marriage.
I will actually. It actually is much better because you've brought us closer. Instead of me being a ranger and her being a hobbit, we're both just different types of hobbits. That's good. Yeah, and I love the idea of being a toque. Thank you.
But now your question on progress, where are we progressing to, or where should we be progressing to? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. I think as human beings, especially humans who consider ourselves created in the image of God, we are always striving towards the best understanding of ourselves with under the blood of Christ. And so that is where we should be perfecting to. It's like what Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. And so what we are striving toward is a spiritual, intellectual, and physical being of the best person that we are supposed to be in the image of Christ.
Okay. That seems pretty clear.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Talking about it is easy. Living it is the challenge.
Right. Well, I look at the required texts for this class, and then in fact you do close with the Hobbit, or the Hobbit's the last of the list. And I just love that the Hobbit. We're getting a little bit of an echo. I think we're good now. Yes, I just love that the Hobbit begins in a place smoking a pipe in contentment, and ends in the same place smoking a pipe in contentment. That's always been just a favorite aspect of that book for me. But we start out with a bang, Genesis and Exodus. And of course, Exodus is an easy thing to see with the journey. You've talked about the garden, the Odyssey, the history of Herodotus. But then we get medieval on it, and we have Dante's Inferno. We have the travels of Marco Polo. I'd love to talk about some of this medieval stuff. Where does Dante and where does Marco Polo fit into your class?
Dante is, a movement, and it's a movement downward. And I think what it's showing is the relationship that our physical choices have with our spiritual life. And so, we're tracing it downward. And we don't go into the whole trilogy where we actually get to Paradiso, but at least there's this understanding that the decisions that I make, the movements that I make, what I say, what I do is going to have an impact on me at a later time. And so it's just another reflective way to look at that synthesis between the body, the mind, and the soul. Mm-hmm. As far as Marco Polo, I find him, I'm not a Marco Polo scholar or anything like that, but it was just, I came across his work travels when I was doing my dissertation research. And I was just fascinated about, he left home with his father at the age of 17, spent most of his life abroad, came back, was imprisoned, and then he writes his travels. And the travels are so unique that when he was dying, for example, some of his friends, had suggested that he needed to confess because he had lied so much in his book. And he says, no, this is what has really happened. And so there's this idea of maybe fantasy and make-believe and yet reality. And he was somebody who spent so much time in a culture that wasn't necessarily his own, and then yet trying to come home again. And I think that in some ways can be reflective of what we are right now. I love studying apologetics, and even though it's not my formal study, and cultural studies. And I think that's a little bit of what we're facing right now, too, is this idea that in a way we're in a culture that seems so foreign to what we're accustomed to, and we want to go back, and yet what is it that we're going to go back to? And so, there's a link in an odd way. I have this odd way of linking things that don't make sense to the normal mind, but to me, they make sense. And so that's why it's there.
Okay. Well, it's thought-provoking to consider that, the experience of Marco Polo was so alien to his home audience that it moved to being unbelievable. But there's also Marco Polo may have spent his entire life abroad, but he was always going to be an Italian. So I would love to hear just some of your personal take on perception in travel. There's a sense in which you will always be an outsider, whether it's a long weekend in Iceland, because passage is cheap from Washington, D.C. to Iceland, or whether you actually are spending months and years in a place. There's a sense in which the outsideness can never. How does that affect our perceptions and our interactions when we travel?
I think that is one of the challenges of travel. And that is, in many ways, we are always the outsider. There's the common element that we have as human beings, but there's going to be that cultural difference. I think that in that difference is when we learn a lot about ourselves. Why do I do the things that I do? Who am I? And that is such an important part of travel, I think, is encountering that otherness, because in looking out, we almost hold up a mirror and look back at ourselves and ask who we are, which, in my opinion, is why there's such a big difference between, say, 19th century travel literature and what we now have of the 20th century or 21st century mass tourist movement. I think, there's two things there, in my opinion. And the first is, like, with this mass tourism, things are so similar now. You can go to, Japan and go to Disney World and eat at McDonald's and not experience otherness. And it's all done for you. And I think, and now, like in the 21st century, what we're seeing a lot of is people don't have that connection of home. And so there isn't that tug home, because many people are, consistently away from home and maybe even avoiding home.
Yeah. Well, there's a term that is now escaping me. I think it was a French term to describe young aristocrats of the 18th, 19th century, early 20th century, taking a year or two after their education was completed just to travel.
The Grand Tour.
That's right, the Grand Tour, yes.
It started off as this idea, and that too is for self-knowledge. It started off as this idea. A lot of it is based on, for example, John Locke, where you need to experience to learn. And so the idea was you could learn things from a book, but then to go out and experience was the completion of the education. Some people would suggest that later on it just became an opportunity of sowing wild oats.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that does lead me to another question. First, I'd like to interact with Roxana's comment. When I spend time in Spain, I feel right at home. I would love to hear, Roxana, why it is, since you're not Spanish, you feel right at home in Spain. I think that would be great fodder for conversation. But so the question, kind of inspired by the Grand Tour, is, at least in theory, it's a purposeful, right? It's for the improvement of the soul. We're doing this to better ourselves. Is that something that is a part of modern tourism, or have we just kind of foregone the self-improvement part? There has been some recent work on the phenomenon of signaling through travel. Like, I am the sort of person who travels, and that in itself is seen as a good. But do we still retain the idea of travel for improvement? And should that even be an idea we retain? Does travel improve?
I guess you're going to have to define improve and what improving what. And I think a lot of it is going to depend on the mindset of the individual. My husband and I recently went to Europe, and for example, we spent 3 or 4 days in a very, very small town. And when we were there, we would see mass buses of people come in, and the town would be flocked with literally 5,000 to 10,000 people that were there. They took a couple of snapshots, they did Hallstatt, and then they left. And then the question is, okay, were they improved? There's the selfie of me there. I have evidence, but have I been improved? And the question is, well, did you really engage? Was there any otherness that was experienced, or were you traveling with your group? And so I think a lot of it depends on the mindset of the individual going out and what it is they're trying to do.
Well, it does sound from your answer as if you value otherness as interacting with otherness as I see you nodding. So that is something that otherness in itself is something we should at some point, at least in our lives, seek to engage with for improvement.
I think so. And if I can give an example, this last time when we went to Europe, I had an interaction with a German. And in the beginning, it didn't start off well because it was a packed train and people were going to the soccer matches and all of the pre-game things that go on. And I had asked him if he could move his luggage, please. And I speak German, and I lived in southern Germany, so I speak with an accent. And at first he was a little bit huffy, but he moved his luggage. And then across from us was an American couple. And then this man started talking, and he was really being derogatory toward this other couple. And finally I leaned over to him and I said, "I'm an American." And we had this discourse then where he's talking about our politics and a lot of other things. By the end of the conversation, though, we were friends, and it was Mother's Day. He came over, he wished me a happy Mother's Day. I wished him and his mother a happy Mother's Day. But what happened was, in that encounter of otherness and explaining to one another who we are and just really having that human contact, there was a bridge that was gapped, or that was covered. And so I do believe that in experiencing otherness, we learn about ourselves and we learn about the other individual and how to start making some of those connections.
Yeah. Well,
now I have a German friend.
Yeah, right. Which is very cool. And I think that's one of the reasons I love traveling. It's actually interacting with the people. It's not seeing the sights. Part of your story there connects with Roxana's comment about feeling at home in Spain, and she's followed up with us and saying that she thinks that has to do with language because she is a Spanish speaker. And then you're in Germany, and your German is good enough that they can't quite tell that you're American. I'm not sure what level you're at, right? But there's because of your fluency with German, you can have these sorts of interactions. Roxanne can have interactions in Spain. So this is just a plug for our language departments and our many language classes. But I'd love for you to talk about, again, this is outside your area of expertise, just a personal take about the benefits of studying language, a foreign language.
Wow.
Yeah, I know it's a big thing. Just be personal about it.
For me personally, it has opened up a whole new world. One is when I went to Germany, I lived there as an exchange student right after high school. And I told my parents I wanted to learn how to speak like a German. And so they were correcting me to continue to learn how to speak it. And it helped me get acceptance in Germany. There is nothing like, going to another country and speaking the language. So there is acceptance there. For me, there are always, I have many different thoughts right now, but so there is that. It also gives me the opportunity to read in a different language, and I do have a different mindset. I'm thinking German right now, and so I'm having a very difficult time making that switch. So that is one of the benefits of it, is that it does give you a new perspective of it. And I think the other thing that it helps me with is that I have many friends who are first generation Americans or they've just immigrated over. Because of my experience in Germany and knowing what it feels like to be an outsider, it has made me very empathetic toward people that I come into contact with who are trying to learn the language or who don't quite understand the linguistic innuendos that we make when we make jokes with one another. They don't get it. I'm mindful of that. And so it's helped me on both sides of the pond.
Yeah, sure. Well, and, empathy is something, all Christians should strive to have empathy and sympathy. But there's also a sense in which it needs to be trained up, and it doesn't come naturally to us. It is something I value in the upbringing of my own children, and then try to inculcate that. And travel and language is I guess, an easy way to do that. But yeah, it is interesting to think of like your tour bus is coming into Holstadt or whatever the name of the city was, a small town. When you're busing in like that, you're not putting yourself in a position to learn that empathy. You're not putting yourself out there to go through the ringer, as it were. And there's value in that.
I think there is value, and I think in some ways the mindset of the mass bus coming in almost promotes a self, I'm looking for a self-first mentality, especially, and as I heard you say Hallstatt, by the way, it's in Austria, not Germany. But anyway, I made the mistake. I told you incorrectly. But the point I think that happens is if you know that you're only going to be there for an hour or so, I need to hurry up and get my souvenir, my photo, whatever. And so that limited exposure, I think, almost does the antithesis of what travel can do, and that is to help breed empathy.
So let's move from exotic European locales to exotic American locales. One of the works in your class is a quintessentially American one, though Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is on your reading list. Talk to us a little bit about that piece and its significance in your course.
Most of my dissertation work has been with Mark Twain. I mean, throughout most of my program, I'm just fascinated with him as an author and the influence that he's had in American culture. And Huckleberry Finn, I know it's a controversial book, but I think one of the things that it really does is it brings about togetherness. It talks about, what it means to be human. You have this outcast boy and this runaway slave who come together, and on their raft, they are creating their own society of equality and respect for one another, and learning what it is to understand the qualities of being human. And so once again, there is movement in the sense that, yes, they're moving down the river, but they are also moving internally to recognize what it is to be a human. I just taught this course through Kepler over the summer and had some wonderful discussions with young adults about, what does it mean to be a respecter of another person? And what is the harm that comes when we just slap a label on somebody and we don't take the time to recognize the humanness of the individual? And so that's a lot of the focus of Huckleberry Finn.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that you compare the physical movement on the river, but they're moving internally, and you seem to emphasize the importance of that. Scott Postman makes a comment. Patrick Fermers said this about his walk across Europe to Byzantine. I wanted to gaze at things with a changed eye and listen to new tongues that were untainted by a single familiar word. And I think that perhaps people who have already learned to value movement and travel can sometimes just sort of take for granted that it's a good. We already kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe in the light of the quote that Scott has shared with us, and then just in the light of the conversation we've had up until now, what about the importance of internal movement, and maybe even is travel necessary for it?
I think that travel is not necessary for it, which is one of the reasons for example, 19th century travel literature. And a lot of the travel literature is because there were many individuals who could not travel. They just did not have the financial means or whatever. And so literature becomes that vicarious experience for the individual. And I do think that with the mindset of I am going to move toward understanding, from ignorance to understanding by way of literature, there is going to be an intellectual movement. I think, though, that if it is not with the soul movement, in a way, it's all for naught. It's kind of like Paul talks about, I'm a loud and clanging gong. And that is that if my mind and my body and my soul are not aligned and moving toward, which is what we talked about earlier, the best understanding of what it means to be human in the image of God, then in a way it's really not for anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so my family has in fact traveled a good bit, and we have valued the good that can do. And yeah, I still told my kids, you don't need to travel for these goods that we're holding up. What you need to do is read. It sounds like a library slogan, but you can travel through books, and certainly in my thinking, at least, that's very real. You are very really experiencing the same things that you would if you were traveling, if you were reading. I'm still having trouble maybe accepting that in, say, a travel documentary. There's certain media where it's a little harder to. But yeah, what's your take on that? Do you enjoy travel documentaries and watching film about different areas? Does that have the same sort of impact for you that a book might?
Well, I think part of it, our culture has become such a visual culture where there is so much of it that, personally, once in a while, I will enjoy a good travel documentary. Usually it makes me envious because then I want to go travel again. But expounding also on what we were talking about with reading is another way of experiencing travel vicariously. But I also think right now in our culture, especially since we're such a multicultural society nowadays, that if we would just get out of our comfort zone, even within our own community, and interact with somebody who is from a different country, there is just so much. I have some wonderful friends who are Indian, and I love it when they invite me over because I get all of their Indian food. And so, we have the opportunity even without traveling. I wanted to get that in, and then I'm looking at a quote here on the screen.
Yeah, sorry. I'm distracting you. Well, there's I wanted to kind of save the last piece of literature, the best piece of literature for last, and you do not have to agree that it's the best, but if I were taking this course, it'd be the one I would be most looking forward to. Let's talk about The Hobbit. We already talked a bit about Tukes and Bagginses, but yeah. So The Hobbit here in your course, what are you guys doing with The Hobbit?
Again, we are looking at movement, and part of this, and I referenced it jokingly when I alluded to your marriage, but there is this desire that we have within us, and I think Bilbo Baggins recognizes it. He's part Tuke that likes to travel and adventure, and he's part Baggins, and he comes back. He does return home, and he has lost his respect. If you read the end of it, they don't respect him the way he's always considered a little odd now, and yet he has gained a peace and understanding of who he is as a hobbit. And so we look at that, and yet there is a part of the Hobbit where he never changes. There is always the Hobbit part of him, the Baggins part. For example, he's an honest thief, which I think is very important to him, that honesty. He treats the dwarves with dignity and respect, even though many times, he doesn't, or they don't treat him equally so.
Mhm.
And yet in the end, what happens is that he wins Thorin over to, the goodness of what is there. And so I think that it's just a wonderful balance of showing for self-knowledge. There are parts of us that must remain the same and true, and yet there are parts of us that are going to grow from the adventure and who we're encountering and what we're doing. And that's what we'll be looking at with The Hobbit. We read a lot of intense texts, and I had a professor who, at the end of every class, we would finish with something fun. And that was my goal in that too.
Nice. Although I think the travels of Marco Polo are going to be super fun. But yeah, that's good thinking. I like that. So I'd love to close with a sound bite. I know we've already talked about why students should take your human movement course, but I would love just a pithy little statement telling us why. Take your time, because being pithy isn't easy.
It is not. Okay. Who will you become is a part of who you are now. Oh, you know what? It's going to be from my Big Fat Greek Wedding. Never let who you are interfere with who you will become, but don't let who you become be limited by who you are. And so you're going to become something different because of your exposure to otherness and movement. And you can be the best person that you're going to be.
Boom.
I don't know. That works.
Hey, I love that. And I love My Big Fat Greek Wedding. What a great movie.
Yeah. I got to think of that quote. It's never let who you are limit who you can become, but don't forget to take who you are with you when you become something like that.
That's actually a very Hobbit-like sentiment.
It is. It's
Yeah.
right up there.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here. Thanks to everyone who's been tuning in and commenting. And Karla, you can stay on the line when we're done so we can bid our own private goodbyes. But for now, so long to everybody. And Karla, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Karla Memmott, everybody. So long.